Hi everyone, my name's Eric. Thanks for joining me. I'm recording this on a radiant, beautiful, unseasonably warm London November Saturday. From where I record, the sun is setting that way, and that explains the laser beam across my stomach here. I hope you're doing really well. Thank you for joining me. I want to get on my soapbox for a while. And it's a little weird to do because I expect most of you watching this will actually agree with me. I want to talk about, is fantasy escapist? The reason I want to talk about this is I've been reading some of my favorite fantasy I'm recording this. I have to do everything opposite. Behind me, you can see, no, I go this way. There we go. It's just my favorite fiction that I read over and over and over again. The serious literary stuff is down below on the third shelf. You can't see that, but you can see Gene Wolfe and Narnia up there. Been reading some of it. And I'm reminded of an opinion I met without exception when I was in college with my English professors, to whom I owe so much and from whom I learned so much. I happily acknowledge my debt to them. But without exception, my English professors in college had a really strong, hard and fast, impermeable boundary between serious literary fiction that's realistic, in which the rules of the story world conform to, everyday reality, or at least how most of us experience everyday reality, or at least most of us in the secular West. That's an issue we'll come back to. Serious, literary, realistic, quote-unquote fiction. Because what is real? Who gets to say what's real? There are all kinds of people living in the past who had experienced gods and spirits and whatnot, and they were just a normal part of their lives. That doesn't mean they were right all the time. But why does modern secular Western experience of reality, why is that the standard, the definition? Anyway, that's an aside. We'll come back to that. Maybe, if I remember. Serious literary fiction on the one hand, and genre fiction on the other. Science fiction, fantasy, horror. Guess which they preferred. The only stuff the only real literature is the serious, realistic, quote-unquote fiction. Everything else, genre fiction, is juvenile at best, escapist in the sense of being like avoiding reality in a way that's morally culpable, at worst. And as I've been reading fantasy fiction, I just not only am I not convinced, it bugs me that anyone would think that. There are three reasons why. First of all, the boundary between the two, I had that philosophy explained to me in a very hard and fast, rigid form. But boundary between the two is very, very permeable. Cormac McCarthy's The Road at least counts as mild science fiction, as post-apocalyptic. The Handmaid's Tale, Margaret Atwood, at least mild science fiction, and other works by Atwood fall in that category as well. And yet I think they qualify as, serious literary fiction. A lot of great Western literature, if it were published today, it would fall under the category of genre fiction. Macbeth's witches and Hamlet's ghost and all the stuff that happens in the Aeneid, Dante, Beowulf, So the hard and fast distinction between the two just doesn't work. Second, in realistic fiction, there is just as much escapism going on as there is in fantasy sometimes. I think it's much more convincing to draw the distinction not between realistic and genre fiction, but good examples of both. This may be unfair. So if you've read The Sword of Shannara more recently, and if I'm just misremembering it, I read it in high school. I loathed it. I thought it was cheap Tolkien. I just gagged my way through that book. If that's not fair, leave a comment below. Tell me why. That's fine. But that's an example in my mind of a bad example of unrealistic fiction. But there are all kinds of examples of escapist realistic fiction. Fiction that is Freudian wish fulfillment just by definition. It's an imaginative literary compensation for some disappointment in real life. Young woman falls in love with a handsome millionaire. Or whatever. There are plenty of male equivalents. So escapism doesn't exist on one side of the equation, But third and most importantly, good fantasy does exactly the same thing. To me, at least, my experience is identical with good fantasy as it is with good realistic fiction. When I read King Lear, and King Lear, if it were published today, I think it would count as realistic. No witches or ghosts or anything like that. It's my favorite Shakespearean play. I find that play hypnotic. When I start reading it, I just started reading the first page last time. I had my Shakespeare open. It was an effort of will to stop because I'm just going to sit there and read the whole thing. I find it so moving. When I read King Lear, it is the opposite of escapism because I'm brought home to myself in a profound way. I am more present to myself than I was when I first began reading, and in a beautiful way divested of myself. I'm more aware of other people. It's so great how literature makes you more aware, more thoughtful of, considerate of what other people are going through, how their experience just might be utterly different from yours, In King Lear in particular, that sense of loss and regret, that sense of the scales falling from Lear's eyes, and he realizes his life is a bomb crater, and it is his fault, and there is nothing he can do. Nothing he can do. That sense of betrayal, people stabbing him in the back, and that sense that suffering can purify you. It can change you. You're not stuck with who you are forever. All those are that's real. That's how life is. And they're more really present to me after reading King Lear. Same thing happens in fantasy fiction. I've been rereading Lord of the Rings. It's my 5th or 6th time through it. I can't remember. It is like sweet wine to read. It is better than ever. Because it brings me home to the fragility of things and the worth of things. There's stuff that's worth fighting for. It amazes me how the characters in the novel live with the burden of this civilization that's been around for like 3,000 years, that they live in the shadow of, that they're trying to preserve. And, the elves are leaving. There's a lot of things that are profound, beautiful, subtle things that are going out of the world that will be lost. But there's still stuff worth fighting for. Now, Tolkien, in his introduction to The Lord of the Rings, rails against an allegorical reading of the book. He rightly says that if it was all just an allegory for World War II, then the good guys would have used the ring against the bad guys, right? Which isn't what happened, obviously. And that's all completely true. And yet there is... good fantasy is as realistic as any other kind of fiction. The way friendship is portrayed, the way evil is portrayed... The good characters in Tolkien are all vividly different from each other. The evil characters are all the same. I think that's wonderful. Neil Gaiman's Coraline is another example. I'm going to review Neil Gaiman. I hope a lot of his work because I really like him. But I think Coraline, it's maybe not my favorite fantasy novel, but I think it is the most perfect fantasy novel I've ever read. It is a flawless gem of a book. And it begins with a quote from G.K. Chesterton saying, fairy tales are more true than true, not because they talk about dragons, but because they tell us dragons can be beaten. And he's right. He's right. There is something about the human mind that thinks sideways. It's natural for us to think metaphorically. And there's something, and so it's unfortunate to say the least when very keen readers of literature dismiss the deep metaphors of fantasy. And there's something sideways about reality itself. There's something about reality. The large-scale metaphors and symbols of fantasy aren't just a human imposition on brute fact. I think there's something about reality itself that is sideways. I'm not suggesting some kind of literalism here. I don't think Narnia or Cthulhu it literally exists. And yet I do not think the only things that are real are the stuff that science can study, important as that is. If that's true, then there's so much that makes no sense to me. Fantasy fiction is just a deeply appropriate, moving, nourishing, and growing way to connect with what's real in every sense of the word. And it's helpful for me to remember that even though they weren't right about everything, most of the human race experienced the world in a distinctly different way from the way I do as a modern, middle-class white man living in a secular context. That's what I think. Thank you so much for stopping by. Let me know what you think. If you want to argue, please feel free. I'm not really up, much for arguing online, but I would love to hear what you think as well. This is about a conversation, not just me pontificating. And now I'm going to step off my soapbox. Thanks, everyone.